Rest, that is something that we do every day or weekly or other times of the year. And we also know from the Bible that God has established Sabbath rest. But what is the purpose of this rest? And so today we shall look into the purpose of Sabbath through a biblical, theological, and practical perspective. Now, first of all, the basis of observing the Sabbath. Now, in Exodus chapter 20, it mentions about Sabbath as cessation from work. 6 days you shall do your work, and on the seventh day you shall rest. And the basis of this 6 days work and 1 day's rest comes from God's creation, a 7-day cycle. But yet, when it comes to Deuteronomy chapter 5, it gives a slightly different perspective on what the Sabbath rest is about. This time, the emphasis seems to be on relief from toil. Now, the basis of observing rest in the family, in the household, becomes their former experience in Egypt. They were once upon a time slaves in Egypt. They were exploited. They had no rest. They had to toil. Now that they have been delivered, they must remember to let their household rest from toil. And therefore, we see here the black words, the words in black, are the wordings from Deuteronomy chapter 20, and the wordings in green are from Deuteronomy 5:14. Now we do notice that this word you or your appears repeatedly in this verse. Now, it's noteworthy that is you here not apparent in English, whether it's singular or plural. But when we look at the text, the Hebrew text tells us it's a singular. So who does it refer to? It refers to the father of the household who had family members, servants, and so on. So as the father of the household, he is responsible for the welfare of his family. Now it is also interesting to note that for Deuteronomy, it expands a little bit here to state what kind of animals are involved. Certainly they are not pets, but they are animals that perform economic work for the household. And we also see this green clause here that explains the purpose of having the whole household rest. It is not just the master that gets to rest, but his whole household, all those who work for him. And Leviticus continues to explain in detail about the Sabbath. It reiterates that it's about rest from work. And there are other days of Sabbath besides the seventh day. They are usually associated with feasts, such as the Passover and so on. Now we can categorize the feasts into two main categories, one of which is through these feasts they will remember how God has delivered them from Egypt, and also God's provision for them. And we can see that these Sabbath rest days associated with the feast is very similar to the public holidays that we have nowadays. These are on top of the seventh day. And then Leviticus continues to explain about the Sabbath year. So after working for 6 years, we're supposed to rest the seventh year. But what do we do on the seventh year? It's not everybody gets to rest. The land gets to rest. Why does the land need rest after 6 years of cultivation? Because of the depletion of the nutrients from the land. The land needs time to restore the nutrients. And the second thing that they would do on the seventh year is to set free the Hebrew slaves. Now, why do they do that? Why do people sell themselves as slaves? Because they were poor. They sold themselves into slavery because of their economic crisis. And the seventh year gave them a chance to restore freedom. And also, on the seventh year, there will be canceling of debts. Now, why do people borrow money? Unlike us, nowadays we borrow money to buy cars and houses. No, they don't. They were poor. That is the reason why they borrowed money. And at the cancelling of the debts, it gives people who are steeped in poverty a chance to be restored, to start anew again. And also on the Sabbath year, there was the reading of the law in order that the people might remember the law and to obey it. And the purpose of the Sabbath year is to curb economic exploitation and provide relief from oppression. So what are the implications and applications for us? First of all, we see that among the resources that perform economic activity, we see that Leviticus tells us that it includes natural resources like the land, and it also includes human resources like us. Now, in the performance of economic activity, there certainly will be certain pressures put on these resources. Although this is a natural phenomenon, but pressures need to be relieved. We need to be relieved from the fatigue from work and relieved from the economic difficulties that we run into in all these activities. So what do we need? First of all, if we have been constantly working pressure, our natural resources and our human resources, we will need relief. We will need relief from these pressures, and we will need renewal to continue on. So, for the ancient father of the household, he is responsible to ensure that all the people and the animals who are performing economic activity for the household has an opportunity to be relieved of the pressures of life and to be renewed. So nowadays in our modern society, what would be the analogous situation for us? Very few of us live in cultures in modern cities where there's still the household, the father of the household. Our nearest analogy would probably be our employer-employee relationships, or even for people who have authority over others, such as the household and the household helpers, or teachers over their students. So we need to be aware that we are responsible for the welfare of those who work for us. Do we consider how much work we actually give them? Do we have a so-called entitlement of leave, but yet leaves our employees no opportunities to even take their leave? Do we have so-called a rest day out of the week, but we gave our people so much work that they could not finish their work during the weekdays? And we as teachers, do we give so much work to our students that we actually give them no chance to rest? It seems that perhaps throughout the generations, we may have this outward observance of Sabbath rest in one way or another, but have missed the true meaning of Sabbath. It happened during Israel's time, during Isaiah's time. That was exactly what the Israel leaders were at that time. And during Jesus' time, we see many Pharisees as well having this problem. And these are the verses that show what is happening. And Matthew 12 is where we will look into in a little bit of detail. So it comes as no surprise, before chapter 12 is this very familiar verse we know. Come to me, Jesus says, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. And thereafter in chapter 12, we have two stories of the Sabbath. The first one, plucking the grain on Sabbath. The Pharisees claimed that the disciples had broke the law. And then when Jesus healed on the Sabbath, the Pharisees again claimed that Jesus broke the law. But yet, the hungry are the ones who need food to be relieved and renewed. This is a provision already given in Deuteronomy chapter 23. And in Isaiah, when Yahweh rebuked the leaders, he said, is it not to share your food with the hungry that I, Yahweh, require of you? Now, the one who is infirmed by illness needs healing to be relieved and renewed. Again, In the same verse in Isaiah, it says, "Is it not to turn away from your own flesh and blood that I, Yahweh, require of you?" They were turning away from their own kinspeople who were infirmed. And we continue to see in Isaiah 58, 9-10, that if they were to do away with the yoke of oppression and with the pointing finger and malicious talk, and if they would spend themselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then their light will rise in darkness and their night will become like noonday. And we see that Jesus fulfills this essence of the Sabbath, because we see that Matthew, after talking about these two stories of the Sabbath, says that Jesus fulfills the words of Isaiah the prophet. "A bruised reed he will not break. One who is so hungry and need food, he will not disallow them to get grain. The smothering wick he will not snuff out. One who has been infirmed for so many years with illness, he will not let the oppression go on." And what is the implications and applications for us? As we do some reflections, perhaps we think of our daily life and our daily work. Do we have so much work that we are afraid that we cannot finish and then we do not rest? Or as we mentioned just now, as people who are supervisors, who have people work under us, how do we give them the amount of work that is adequate for them to rest? And as we go on for further reflections, let's think about the church activities we have. Now, meeting together in the church is a good thing. We are supposed to come together to worship together and to encourage one another. But yet, we can be very caught up with church activities. There could have been cases where church activities take out the entire Sunday for people who serve in various committees, in various activities. And sometimes we may be very inclined to fill up every public holiday with church activities as well. So by doing so, are we actually providing spiritual renewal to our people, or are we causing them to be more fatigued than before? So these are very general implications and applications that we can think about. Do we observe the Sabbath rest in its true meaning? So in conclusion, we have gone through and seen that God's establishment of the Sabbath is to provide relief and renewal from toil. And this is mainly to prevent economic exploitation. And we also talked about the need for balance. Sometimes we have these outward observances of rest days and leave entitlement. And sometimes we ourselves may not be observing them and getting adequate rest. But yet, even if we have all these in place, we need to constantly remind ourselves what is the true meaning of the Sabbath. It's to provide relief and renewal, and to prevent economic exploitation. And we hope that today's reflections will bring further thoughts into our lives as we contemplate not just resting for ourselves, but rest for those who work under our supervision.